Hey guys, it's 10 Types, and today I'm going to be making a top 10 list of the Fusion Strike meta, what decks are the best, and how good they are, and also why they are the way that they are. Before we get into this, though, obviously top 10, and I'm going to have some dishonorable mentions as well, but there are a few decks that I'm not going to really be including in the selection process. You see I have the category card grouped in here, and essentially you see that we have two Suicune decks, two Urshifu decks. We have Mew and Genesect. Then we have two single strike decks, and I've decided to leave them off because they are pretty similar to one another. And we don't want the top 10 list to just be like a bunch of the same decks over and over, because that's not really interesting or useful. But keep in mind that I think that a lot of the decks that are right next to each other there are very similar in builds and ideas, and they're definitely, I'd say each of them has some viability, but more viability when it's the build that I'm going to put into the top 10 list. But I'll leave the ones that are grouped in down below in case you're wondering about them. But the ones I'm going to take off, I'm going to be using Suikune Ludicolo, Urshifu Moltres, Emacs, and Single Strike Urshifu with Umbreon because the Gengar isn't as strong in my opinion. But first of all, I have some dishonorable mentions, some decks that I'm certainly not too fond of in the current standard format. I definitely have some bias against them, but I definitely think they're coming up a little short on this top 10 list. They're not anything particularly amazing. The first one is, unsurprisingly, Victini VMAX, a deck that's very straightforward, and honestly very boring. It just focuses around the usually 4/4, sometimes 3/3 Victini VMAX, and just tanking for heavy damage every single turn, and then using stuff like crushing hammers, and custom catchers to control, or catcher, not custom catcher, to control the game, high counter boss, pretty much all four ofs. It's not really an interesting deck, and also it doesn't have anything particularly special, so it's not like meta breaking, and doesn't really go into the top 10. It's certainly not a bad deck, but not an interesting nor particularly powerful one. Then another one I have is Malomar. This is definitely a deck I don't like, and certainly it's probably better than I give it credit for, but at the end of the day, it's a single prize deck, which certainly puts it down quite a bit. And it obviously can do really big damage with a Trapper Strike Tentacles attack, but will usually come up a bit short in my experience, or get shut down completely by spread type decks like Dragapult and Jolteon and Urshifu and stuff like that. So I feel like the deck will just generally come up a bit short, or it just won't be able to get there and will fall short because it doesn't have gusting. You can obviously include stuff like the Passimian to deal some snipe, but I find that it's super setup based. It needs all these pieces all the time. While it is interesting with all the sequencing puzzle, I feel like it'll just not be quite strong enough. But getting into the top 10, we first of all, in 10th spot, have a very powerful deck in Inteleon VMAX from Fusion Strike that is Rapid Strike Pokemon using Rapid Strike energy, attacking for 140 every single turn, and also being able to shell off damage. And the deck's very strong because you're essentially invincible, assuming your opponent isn't able to disrupt you. But a few problems. One, there's a ton of disruption in Mari, which is in like every deck. So you're gonna get the rapid strike energies that go back into your hand right away. You can certainly draw into them again. But if you don't, you're in a really bad spot. Also, the Sherrills can just like run out of them. You're not gonna be using bosses orders and as well. And also finding the water energies to discard with the ability on Italian VMAX can be difficult. The deck's pretty solid, but it just generally has a lower damage output and it can get outsped as you're trying to set up and maintain a stable board state. So overall, the deck is very solid and can do really amazing things when it gets going, but sometimes it just falls short and doesn't really get there. And as I said, is somewhat vulnerable to disruption as well. We have another deck that I'd say has a weaker damage output. That's Jolteon of Emacs. It has its, I believe, Gmax Thunder Rumble. I might be getting that one a bit wrong, but it's really powerful. doing 100 to the active and 100 to a bench with 1 damage with damage Pokemon with any damage counters on it, which is really nice and pairs nicely with stuff like Learn Suicune or Inteleon from Chilling Reign. But it's just really shut down by stuff like New VMAX's fusion energy and generally can struggle to get through big Pokemon. It's essentially one attachment with a tool, or it can just be 2 attachments as well. So the one attachment gives you access to Cheryl, but because of its lightning type or its lightning typing with its fighting type weakness, it can be pretty vulnerable to getting one-shotted, which means the Cheryl's obviously useless. So I find that the deck has a lower power level, obviously, than a lot of other decks, and has bad matchups against a number of the really, really powerful decks in the format. This lightning typing does allow it to hit stuff like the Inteleon VMAX for weakness or the Suicune for weakness, but at the end of the day, you're still not one-shotting them, so it's not a huge deal. It obviously helps you in that matchup, and those matchups are pretty solid for Jolteon. We are still never getting those one shots, and obviously it plays a high count of past the peak. I think it might play like 4, maybe 3, but certainly it goes pretty heavy into that, which is really good against decks like Mew VMAX and some of the Galarian Moltres Vs in decks, but it's generally not going to stick because if a deck really loses to path, it plays at least 4 stadiums, sometimes even more. Stuff like Mew plays a number of different stadiums. So you're generally going to not have that sticking. And while it does let you go through something like Zamazenta if you really need to, it generally isn't powerful enough. But speaking of Zamazenta, you have Zacian Zamazenta right here. That would be in the 8th spot, which is really powerful because it can apply a ton of pressure. Specifically, Zacian could just attach, accelerate an energy with Intrepid Sword, and attach another energy, and the deck plays a high count of boss's orders, so you can often target down a Pokemon V, assuming you go first, which is really nice. And the Oranguru can guarantee the energy accelerated, and there's a number of really powerful parts to this deck in the early game, but if you miss some of the pieces like Oranguru or enough metal energy, you can be in a really bad spot. The deck's really simple because it just plays tons of 4-ofs of like Marnie and Research usually, White Place and Raihan, with a bunch of balls. Pretty straightforward though. And Assassin's obviously a really efficient attacker and can heal up with Crystal Cave and defend itself with Cape, but there are definitely a number of decks that can one-shot Zacian or pick away at it with Inteleons and probably bump the Crystal Cave. So things can go pretty badly if your opponent starts one-shotting Zacian. And then your other plan of Zamazenta V to stall is pretty decent in a format where there isn't path around because you do have Crystal Cave to bounce path, so it's not the end of the world. But there's also a lot of more powerful Pokemon Vs. In pre-rotation, stuff like Eternatus and Centiskorch were the main VMAXs, and the Vs were truly atrocious. But now we have a lot more powerful Pokemon Vs. The Inteleon V, the Jolteon V, and some of the later Vs are even stronger, honestly. So Zamazenta is not really going to be strong enough, and being able to not attack every turn with Zacian can get awkward as well. And overall, the deck just can kind of clog itself up. And when you're met with a difficult situation, there's unfortunately not really anything you can do about it, and you usually just lose in that situation. So the deck is very strong, but it falls a little short in that aspect. And then we have another really powerful deck, honestly, one that I'm much more of a fan of, but not necessarily the highest power level or consistency, but that would be Sylveon VMAX paired with obviously a number of different options. Keep in mind that with this tier list, I'm not saying this specific build is the best. I'm saying the deck as a whole is, which might be a little controversial and not always the perfect answer because I just say a Pokemon and a deck idea as opposed to the exact 60. But with Sylveon, you have powerful attackers like Blaziken, you have Urshifu, and you also probably have the Moltres. You might have Leafeon as well, or instead of Moltres, but there's a number of really powerful options you can use to mix things up. For example, the Blaziken's against Zacian or Leafeon is really good, and Sylveon has a great weakness, hitting the Urshifus for a weakness, which is really good. And also, not having that dark weakness on your main attacker is extremely powerful because that means you're not going to get one shot by stuff attempting to hit decks like Dragapult and Mew for weakness because you can just go in there with your Sylveon, and with that metal weakness, you're not really that scared of them. Obviously, you are weak to Zacian and Zamazenta now, so that matchup can get tricky, but you have Blaziken, so it's not the worst thing in the world. And the fact that you can put these tech options in so easily because of Sylveon's colorless attack cost is really nice. And it's really powerful right now because you can get it up pretty efficiently and you have ways of accelerating energy with Moltres Energy Switch or, as I said, Leafeon. And the deck's very efficient and very powerful. And as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the best VMAX attackers. They're pretty straightforward, just hitting for that 200 damage range and taking out one shots on Vs for very powerful turn one going first scenarios and two-shotting VMAXs. One thing you do lose out on is obviously the Inteleon engine. You instead have the artillery, which means you're going to struggle to boss a bit more. But luckily, you can play the game slower and use stuff like Blaziken to maintain a really stable board state and snipe with stuff like Rapid Strike Urshifu. So overall, the deck has a few weaknesses in that it can be a little awkward to get up consistently or find early gusting. But it's made up for it, and it's a really great toolbox, and it's overall a very solid deck. And then we come to the sixth best deck, and that is Dragapult VMAX right here. Dragapult's been a really powerful deck last format, but right now it's really good because it just KOs all the Sabbles on the bench pretty easily in combination with Chilling Reign and Talion or Zigzagoons, and it can completely destroy engine setting up, which is pretty much its main strength. The main issue with the deck, though, is again lower damage output, and you just won't be able to deal with these big VMAXs once they get set up. You'll just hit into them, but you'll just have an unfavorable prize trade, which is really brutal for the deck because once they get set up, there's not much you can do about it. You have crushing hammers, but you're not really going to get rid of more than one energy in a turn. You have path to slow them down, but usually they can get set up before their path, and games are usually decided sometimes by coin flip because Dragapult's, of course, a very consistent deck with the Inteleon engine. So if you go first, you're really in a strong spot. But if you go second, you can be in a really bad spot. And you do play Raihan to counter some of that disadvantage. But when you're KO'd, if after you're KO'd, you can respond with the Dragapult pretty often. And even the Dragapult V's attack isn't bad. I believe it does 140 for 2 if you swing in that turn. So it has some powerful attacks, but generally not doing enough to take out V maxes or Vs in a quick enough manner. So the deck will fall a little bit short. Uh, Going into the top five, I'd say there's a noticeable gap between the top five and the 6 through 10 because these decks are much more powerful and just hit really hard, are really consistent, really put on a ton of pressure or have ways of, if they fall behind, coming back. The 6 through 10 and below generally can't come back too well or don't have the early pressure, but the top decks are really good and also have really solid matchups in general. On number 5, I have Mew VMAX, which is probably the most controversial deck here. Not that it's on this list, because of course it is, but not fairly controversial that it's not number one. And honestly, the deck doesn't seem very solid. It seems solid, but not extraordinary in any way. It certainly hits the 200 damage range solidly, and I've rarely seen it miss the attack, which is nice. But sometimes you can fail to set up early if you don't have Val VIP passes or quick balls to search out the Genesects in your early turns. So sometimes you'll see slow starts from the deck, but that's not super common. The bigger issue is that there's so many ways of countering this deck. We see a number of Path to the Peak decks like Jolteon and Dragapult, and the fact that they play Path almost makes up for their lower damage output. Because now you can just go through Mew, and Mew's gonna like fall short, gonna be stuck in these awkward positions where you can't really do very much with it. So cards like Path are really bad for the deck, but even worse is special energy denial in the form of something like Duskmore. That's not great because it shuts them down in terms of capture energy, but even worse is something like Crushing Hammer, Fan of Waves, or even Yveltal from Celebrations, a card that just discards 3 special energy from their board and play. so they just remove a ton of their energy, and the deck's almost entirely special energy. So once you don't really have good access to that special energy, that will kind of fall apart, and you'll just be stranded, not really doing too much. And its toolbox of attacks and stuff like Latias's walling attack, and you also have options such as Mew V's like Shuffle In attack, which is a heal style attack, and Mew V Max's other attack that is a wall break effect. And those are all very solid, give you more outs to unique situations, but generally the deck falls pretty short when you are met with these hard counters like Path and Special Energy. And its biggest weakness is, well, its weakness. Having a dark type weakness is really bad because Glare Moltres V is super easy to stick into a number of decks like Sylveon and some other decks we'll see later on in this list. And also stuff like Umbreon is really good. So it's going to fall short when it comes up against these decks. And the meta has so many ways of putting in hard counters essentially to this deck that the deck kind of falls short a little bit in my eyes. Most notably, I'd say Glare Moltres is the big issue, but certainly Path and Energy Disruption is really bad for the deck as well. Certainly solid and can draw well, but can fall short in other situations. And we go on to deck number 4, which is Single Strike, putting it right there. It's pretty solid with Umbreon and Single Strike Urshifu. You also have Gengar if you want it, as I mentioned before, but it really can just not set up super well sometimes. It really needs the Houndooms out, and having an extra evolution to set up by turn 2 while also not giving access to a powerful engine is sometimes really bad for the deck. It can just prick a bunch, and obviously it hits a really hard G-Max one blow on Single Strike Urshifu V-Max can really easily take, or not necessarily always very easily, but it can definitely take one shots on cards on VMAXs and definitely on Vs. So that's really nice. And Umbreon VMAX can also one shot Vs, which is really nice. And even Umbreon V's first attack can deal pretty solid damage, which is nice. And the attackers are really solid. And the support in Houndoom's really solid for powering those up, but you don't have the draw engine, which is really something holding it back, and can often stop it. Like in the early turns, you just don't set up, and you just lose because the game's really fast, and you'll just kind of spiral out of control. Your opponent is taking out either your Houndours if you don't get enough of those set up, or taking out your main attackers. One thing though that is really good about the deck is the type coverage, specifically the Dark type, obviously hitting UV max for weakness, as well as Dragapult for weakness. And you also have Tower Darkness to draw more, and that's also a counter to Path. So you can guess with Umbreon, it could be a stall tactic, but also really aggressive tactic, allowing you, if you set up, to use both Professor's Research and a gusting effect in Umbreon VMAX. So the deck, when it sets up, is really powerful and pretty much unbeatable, but definitely can lose some of the time when it just bricks, which is really bad, and it bricks way more than, honestly, most other decks in the format. So then we come to the top 3, um, and this next one is probably not too surprising. In fact, I very much enjoy. That's Suicune with Ludicolo, a really powerful combination. We have Suikon V, one of the most powerful attackers in the format because it can hit 220 damage if both players have a full bench, which is pretty common because if you look at all these decks here, the only one that doesn't want a big bench is probably Zacian. Mew definitely wants a big bench, getting a bunch of Genesects. And then we see a bunch of Inteleon decks, which want a bunch of Sobbles, Drowzous, and Inteleons in play. And then Sylveon wanting a number of types, and something like Single Strike wanting a bunch of Houndooms. Single Strike won't always hit that upper bench of 5. Sometimes they'll stay around 3, maybe 4, so you won't be able to do one-shots that way. But then they do damage themselves with Houndoom, so it kind of cancels out. So you can often take one-shots on Pokemon with Ludicolo to buff the damage out to 320 or the 300s. So that's really powerful. And then you have, if you come up a little short, you have the Inteleons from Chilling Reign, which is really powerful for cleaning up damage or even applying pressure on Sobble if that's what you choose to do. You also have Fleet Footed to smooth out the damage output, and you have stuff like the Italian engine to keep the deck going well. You also have two really powerful attacks in the form of keep calling on Lotad and the keep calling on the Sabo and the call for family on Lotad, both of which are really solid and very usable because you can use them on your first turn going second. You're not in a horrible position because you can do Melanie attach to the Suicune next turn, and then you have a very powerful attacker set up, even though you didn't have one the previous turn, which is really nice. It's something that pretty much no other deck can say, because it can really get something out of nothing, and the bad starts are pretty much always recoverable. Of course, the deck can brick if you don't get your Pokemon set up quite right, and you'll definitely have that happen sometimes. You might just start a Suicune fleet-footed, not really have much of anything, and then get KO'd. And being a Pokemon V really relies on something like Cape of Toughness or the Ludicolos, both of which can not always work. Cape of Toughness can get Cool Scrappered off, and Ludicolo obviously won't always work because it's a stage 2, use rare candy, and it's really awkward to use. So the deck's generally really powerful, but it will fall short sometimes if you aren't able to survive one-shots or take one-shots. And then we move into the top two decks, and I probably have a bit of a controversial deck here. This is one of my favorite decks, and a really good deck in the format right now. That's Galarian Weezing. Galarian Weezing Sableye or Galarian Weezing Toolbox type deck, which is really powerful because it just gives you so many options, and the ability lock is so good right now. If we see these decks here, we have a bunch of Inteleon engines, and the decks that don't play Inteleon are stuff like Zacian, which needs wants to sharpen sword, Sylveon, which wants artillery, as well as sometimes other abilities like Crobat or Cricketune, or Glen Moltres as well even. And we also have Single Strike, which really needs those Houndooms to keep its energy going. And it's also a deck that can go second. It can do turn 1 Ascension on the Coughing into the Gland Wheezing, which is super powerful because it gives you access to Ability Lock turn 1, which is really brutal for your opponent. And you also do prefer to go first because you want to get up your Wheezing and start poisoning. One of the issues of the deck is that New VMAX, which is really popular right now, has the Fusion Strike energy, which will in fact stop Inteleon pings and Goon pings, so you can't really take one-shots with Sableye. But luckily, VMAX still has that Dark weakness, so you play Grand Moltres V, it's all good. And then also the Inteleon engines, which are all over the place, or the Houndours, which also have like 50 or 60 HP, it might be 70. I don't remember off the top of my head, but you can definitely KO those really easily with the Inteleons plus the Medicham in the deck, which in my opinion is a very solid option because it can buy these extra turns and essentially take extra prizes with its attack, which is really nice. And overall the deck is very solid because it, even if it will sometimes prick, which isn't that often because it has the Italian engine supporting it, but when it does, it's okay because you can fall back on that later Wheezing, and you're generally a single prize deck, sometimes shifting into the two prize territory with Sableye and some of your other attackers, but you're really able to maintain a solid prize trade even if you go down early in the game. And the deck can honestly beat any deck in the format, so it definitely deserves the number 2 spot in my opinion. Moving into the number 1 spot, and we actually come into a really interesting question of, is there an S tier deck? When I say an S tier deck, I mean a deck that is definitely better than all the other decks. It's really your go-to play if you want to win, and definitely a great deck. And it's pretty close, but I wouldn't say there is. And I think the best deck is definitely Urshifu with Galarian Moltres and Inteleon. So the deck's very consistent, has really great damage output with its Gmax Rapid Flow hitting 2 Pokemon for 120, and has a number of really powerful options with stuff like Galarian Moltres to swing into those Dark Weak Pokemon, and also has options like Basculin if you want. It's probably not the most excuse me, probably not the most useful when you do have Galarian Moltres to take the 2-shot. And it's very solid overall, and has all these different options. in terms of trainers as well. You have a ton of switch outs, so you're not really going to get stuck. You probably play Escape Rope in there. You have Tower, so some counters to Path. And you obviously have the powerful Inteleon engine with the Chilling Reign Inteleon. A big focus on that because you'll be picking off weaker Pokemon with your Rapid Flow, and you want to fix the math with Inteleon. And you can also play Passimian and Telescopic Sight. I'm not sure if they're always the best, but they're certainly an option that can boost your damage output some. And the Moltres is really important. As I said, it hits the Dark type weakness, and the Pokemon that are weak to Dark are usually Psychic types, which obviously hit you for weakness. So me VMAX, if you didn't have the Moltres, would be really bad because they just hit into you and one-shot you. You'd like three-shot them, uh, but but by that time, they probably use their like shuffle in attack on the UV, so you pretty much never take any KOs, which is obviously really bad. So instead, you have the Moltres as an alternate attacker, which really wins those matchups. A matchup like Dragapult could be questionable because they can pass the peak to stop you from using Glare and Moltres. But you can still get Moltres powered up pretty easily using stuff like Raihan and then bumping Path with Tower, which is really important. And the Inteleon engine just super strong and fits really nicely in this deck. The main issue is probably finding stuff like Rapid Strike Energy. So a 1/1 Octillery or even a 2/2 could be put into the deck. But overall, I feel like the power in just your draw supporters should be able to find those Rapid Strike Energies. And in the meantime, you can go in with Gale Thrust or with Moltres' attack, which are both really solid and also hit really hard. The main issue with the deck is that it can't one-shot these, but that's generally fine because the deck often will start up slower, but has comeback mechanics in the form of Max Rapid Flow to deal a massive amount of damage to clean up stuff, but also